or going to watch it as a film later on. My name is Paul Sendziuk. I'm a historian at the University of Adelaide, where I teach mainly Australian history. And recently I developed an interest in this place, the Holden, General Motors Holden. Not so much the company itself, and even not so much the cars, but I became very interested in the people that made the cars. And I'll talk a little bit about a project that we've done interviewing former Holden workers and what we've learnt from interviewing those people, and how the research we've done has then fed into the exhibition that's here at the State Library. Thanks very much for the invitation to come and speak for the State Library, and for putting us up, and for the wonderful exhibition that they have. We've jointly helped put on together, but curated by Mark over there. Yeah, if you haven't had a look through the exhibition, please do. It's really fantastic. So, in its heyday, General Motors Holden produced more cars and employed more people than almost any other company in Australia. And that's certainly true for companies based in South Australia. Nearly everyone in this theatre comes from a family that at one point owned a Holden motor vehicle. And it's likely that many of you have either worked at Holden or had an extended family member or members who at some point worked at General Motors Holden, either in Elizabeth or in Woodville. The success and the scale of General Motors Holden has occasioned numerous histories to be produced about the company and the cars that it built and sold and that were raced. But barely any of these histories spend much time talking about the people who actually made the vehicles, those who pressed and bent the metal, moulded the bumpers, cut the fabric trim, and applied the paint. Those that do are generally silent on a crucial aspect of the workplace and the workplace experience, health and safety. So I'm aiming to rectify that in my presentation today. I want to talk about workers' experience of health and safety at General Motors Holden in the post-World War II period, examining in particular whether the company and its workers prioritised safety, how they went about protecting workers from accidents and injury, and the consequences of safety precautions failing. Doing so, I'll have some things to say about how and why the workers remember the things that they do, and how their oral testimonies contrast the official paper record kept by the company. There we go. So my presentation is drawn from a larger project that explores the social history of working life and workplace culture at General Motors Holden since World War II. It's been conducted by a small research team consisting of Jennifer Clark, Carolyn Collins, Al Thomson, and myself. Health and safety is just one of the many aspects of the workplace culture that we're examining. We're also looking, for instance, at industrial relations, the migrant experience, women in the workplace, the impact of technological change, and the experience of workers during the closure of General Motors manufacturing operations, which happens here in 2017. Some of the fruits of our labour is evident in the exhibition here at the State Library of South Australia, and our research has been used to write quite a number of the text panels that you'll see in the exhibition. So our project draws on Holden's extensive paper archive, which was deposited here with the State Library of South Australia, and also nearly 100 oral history interviews that we have conducted with former Holden workers. Extracts from some of those interviews feature in the exhibition, and complete interview recordings have been deposited with and are available from the National Library of Australia. And some of those interviews form the basis of my presentation today, and you're going to be hearing from two of them. In listening to our interviewees, the first and perhaps the most obvious observation we can make is that there was an improved focus and practice of safety at General Motors Holden over time, and thank God. We were fortunate to interview a number of men who worked at General Motors for more than 40, in some cases 50 years, including a couple who started during or immediately after World War II, and they testified to this gradual improvement in safety over time. Harold Onley, depicted here, worked at General Motors Holden from 1941 until 1982. He started as a fitter and turner, and then he ended up in the drafting office. And he said that the workplace certainly became safer, which he put down to innovations in protective equipment and technology. He recalled, for example, the time before high-vis fluoro-coloured clothing was available, when basic safety equipment such as gloves, safety glasses and ear protectors were not routinely supplied, and the days before forklifts were fitted with sights and sounds and lights indicating operation and direction of travel. Forklifts were mentioned by many of our interviewees as one of the most dangerous elements on the factory floor because they were constantly moving about, difficult to hear above the industrial noise, and because the driver's vision was obscured at the front by the load they were carrying. In addition to these innovations, quite a few of our interviewees noted an increase over time of company-mandated safety briefings and training prior to beginning a new role. And they mentioned a company-run scheme by which workers received cash rewards for submitting suggestions that resulted in improved workplace safety. And if you go to the exhibition, there's a little panel talking about the employee suggestion scheme, which you could submit ideas for improved safety. Interestingly, however, our interviewees rarely pointed to other factors that we know gradually improved health and safety in the factory, such as the advocacy of the various unions that acted in the interest of the workers to cajole the company into improving workplace conditions, and advancements in the occupational health and safety regulatory environment, standards imposed by government. This behind-the-scenes toil seems to have escaped the attention of the workers on the factory floor. Interviewees who did mention these things had generally been union stewards or health and safety representatives themselves. General Motors Holden's factories were certainly dangerous places where even the slightest error in risk mitigation could lead to catastrophic injuries. My workplace, the arts faculty at a university, isn't in general a dangerous place. Although I did work at Monash University where there was a shooting in the corridor, so that's not always the case, but in general, universities are not dangerous places. And I don't think I ever truly appreciated how dangerous other workplaces could be and the risks that workers routinely take to provide me with things that I desire, such as cars, until I started interviewing Holden's former workers. Take, for example, the stories told by the first 5 men that I interviewed for the project. These are not the worst cases, but rather quite literally the first 5 guys that I interviewed. Duncan Hockley, who worked as an electrician for 12 years at Holden between 1956 and 1968, recalled the day a fellow Sparky was electrocuted and killed when his spanner dropped across live wires while he was working in a power substation. Mark Horan, who worked in the final assembly line at Elizabeth between 1997 and 2005, had one of his teeth knocked out at work and saw a member of his team partially scalped when his hair got caught in a tool that was powered by compressed air. David Brown, who started at Holden as a machine operator as a 19-year-old in 1976 and finished up 43 years later when Holden's last factory closed, recalled the fingers of a man's hand being severed when he absent-mindedly placed them on top of a die that was pressed. And Paul Nowak, who worked as a press operator at Holden's factories in Woodville and Elizabeth between 1976 and 1986, also recalled a man losing his fingers, among other incidents. Let's quickly listen to him.
You had to be on your guard to make sure you did it properly, and you had to obey all the safety rules because they were incredibly dangerous. And there was one person, I didn't see it, but it was down further, put his hand on the top of the die, and when they pressed the pins, it pushed the die straight up, and he squashed all his fingers, and his fingers were ruined for life. So that was a terrible situation, you know, very horrific. We had a guy come out who was actually a shop steward. He was a crane driver, and he had it drop out of the crane, and the equipment that he had broke, so he actually fell from the crane down on the floor. So he now has a permanent injury on his foot. He was lucky to be alive, but that was an horrific accident.
Yeah. So they'll be many metres up in the air, I imagine.
Well, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. He was lucky to come away still alive.
Yeah. And he's meant to be connected by a belt or something or other?
Yeah, he had a belt, and he connected the belt, but the belt snapped, so it was a defect in the belt. So that became the subject of massive investigations.
So accidents need not have been so gruesome to result in long-term pain or discomfort, and they involved more than just production line workers. Matt Goodwin's here, who began as an engineer at Holden Elizabeth in 1989 and rose to become the director of the plant's entire manufacturing operations by the time of its closure, told us about the time he slipped on some oil, which was ubiquitous in the plant, while walking down some stairs on the factory floor and badly hurt his back, which gave him grief for the next 25 years. When asked about safety at Holden, our interviewees invariably focused on these major accidents, rather than talking about what we might call the unseen injuries of labour, such as hearing loss caused by industrial noise, or repetitive strain injuries and posture injuries. Industrial noise was spoken about during other parts of our interview, such as when the former workers were asked to describe the sights, smell, and sounds of the workplace. Stephen Hack, for example, who worked as an electrician at the Woodville factory between the 1950s and the 1980s, recalled, quote, "It was very loud, very noisy. You'd go into the plating plant and it smelled of acid, and it was noisy with whistles and sirens going off. And the press shop was massive. There was those huge machines in there, huge machines, which I ended up working on. They were very noisy, very, very noisy. You had to wear earmuffs." Don MacDonald, who did his apprenticeship at Holden Woodville in the 1940s and stayed until 1986, told us, and I quote, "It was very noisy, so noisy in fact that a couple of times I went and knocked off at lunchtime and went home. I couldn't tolerate the noise." At work 50 years later, in the final assembly plant that didn't even have big pressing machines, Mark Horan described leaving each shift and entering the car park and becoming aware of a ringing in his ears, like he'd just been to a rock concert or a nightclub. So Holden workers were clearly affected by noise, and thus it's interesting that very few of them linked it to the possibility or likelihood of hearing loss when it came to talking about health and safety. It wasn't something that they brought up. Like I said, they were focusing on these big things like people having their hands crushed, rather than the unseen injuries of labour. Similarly, those who worked on the presses, which moulded large sheets of metal into the shapes of roofs and bonnets, spoke of receiving lacerations from the sharp metal edges, but few mentioned the strain of performing the same placement, pressing, and release movements over and over again at regular rapid intervals, and craning one's neck and twisting one's back in a particular manner over and over as sheet metal was loaded into the die, pressed, and then discharged. It's possible they didn't mention this because it was an intrinsic aspect of the job. These were movements that had to be performed. They couldn't be avoided. The toll on one's body was the inevitable consequence of agreeing to work at Holden and receive a paycheck. The debilitating mental or psychological effect of having to complete repetitive tasks under the pressure of time might be considered another of the unseen injuries of labour. Never let it be said that manual work is not mental labour. Mark Horan worked in the final assembly plant at Elizabeth, fitting components to the chassis of various models of vehicles that came down the line every 73 seconds. This is how he described the process and the effects on him.
Anyone can do it competently, but when these things keep on coming at you, keep on coming at you.
So tell us about the time cycle that you had to work to, because basically you're on the line and it's constantly going to be moving.
So when I first started, I'd approximate that would have been about between 95 and 100 seconds between cycles. At the end, I think it was down to 73.
Wow. And so that means you've got that much time to fit the particular part or to put...
So you've got your standardised procedures, which involve all the different parts that you have to apply to the vehicle in a sequence and in an order, and you have to do that in that time frame.
And that might be easy enough to do on a standard model car, right. But Holden wasn't just producing standard model cars, they had variations on their models, didn't they?
At the end, when I first started, you'd have a Holden. So you'd have an executive, an acclaim, an SS or an S-Pack sort of thing. That's your sedan. And then you'd have your wagon, you'd have your ute, and then you'd have your statesman. There'd be variants in that, you know what I mean? Yeah. That was it. At the end, they had sedans, coupes, dual cab utes, statesmans, and then you'd have variants of left-hand drive of those, variants of Brazil, Saudi Arabia, England, and every different car that was a variant going overseas had something different than a standard, and not something different to swap over, something different on top of that. So I don't know if you want to talk about this now, but the problem was that with the line cycle going down, the options on the cars went up. So you might have a 73-second time frame for a sedan, which is standard, but you'd have a full chock-a-block statesman going over to the Middle East that would probably take you 85, 86 seconds. Now that's all right if you throw one of them in every 5, but it had a point there that the odd car out was the normal executive.
Right.
And it physically got very mentally draining and physically demanding for a lot of people. And I think it's one of the, I don't know if you've talked about people with this previously before, but I think that's one of the straws that really started to get a lot of pushback.
I could really imagine like you're getting into your second last hour of your shift and you are a bit fed up and things aren't going so well and you've jammed your hand a couple of times and you've not, whatever, and you're feeling under pressure and stress. And you're looking down the line and you just want a standard car, you just want one of those easy ones. And the next one's a hard one, the next one's a hard one.
And believe it or not, that is psychology that it's just like, come on, give me a break. Come on already. Because, like I said, it just gets to a saturation point where something's going to have to give here. Either the job's not going to be done to the standard, and I was a perfectionist. I couldn't let anything go. I had pride in my work. I couldn't let anything go down and go, oh, he did that. You know what I mean? Not for the sake of you getting in trouble, just pride in its sake. But you'd eventually get to the point you go, well, I physically cannot do this to that standard anymore. So you'd have to cut, you know what I mean? You'd still get the job done, but it wouldn't be done to the standard that I would have liked.
Yeah. So Mark told me he liked working as a part of a team in the final assembly plant, but he longed for a less mentally stressful and less frustrating job off the line, in the quality assurance section, for example, or driving one of the carts that ferried components to and from the storeroom and the operators on the line. When the company and its former workers talked about health and safety, they did so in very different ways. Company promotional literature and Holden's leaders, some of whom we interviewed, including a former general manager, asserted that workplace safety was the company's #1 priority. Indeed, listed first amongst 6 key performance indicators by which the Australian operations were measured against other General Motors factories around the world was safety. But the company's narrative around safety was framed very differently than that offered by its workers. In company literature, such as annual general reports, internal memos and data files sent to General Motors headquarters in Detroit, Holden spoke about the number of reportable incidents and accidents that occurred in a given period, workers' compensation claims, and work hours and work days that were lost due to injury-induced worker absenteeism. This was, of course, aggregated data, numbers in columns in a spreadsheet or a report, which didn't reveal the names or faces of the injured. Workers themselves spoke about health and safety differently. They spoke of pain, debilitation, the loss of mobility that lingered long after their employment ended. For some, their injuries or debilitation only became truly apparent after they left Holden, and hence couldn't have been recorded in the company spreadsheets. So some that developed lung conditions or hearing loss, it wasn't ever appearing while they're actually working at Holden. As we listen to our interviewees recount some of the accidents that they witnessed, such as men's having their hands crushed or being electrocuted, it's clear some exhibited signs of trauma. I dare say if we pushed them, which we largely didn't, they'll talk about the effect of injuries on the workers' families, playing with their kids and such. This isn't to say that the company and its leaders didn't care or were not concerned about these things as well. But as I said, if we were to write a history of health and safety using only the company's archive of documents and utterances made by the company leaders, we'd end up having to tell a very different story about the implications of health and safety. That's why collecting the former workers' perspectives, largely been neglected till this point, has been so important. Even our interviewees who considered that Holden was very good on safety and much better than the companies they had previously or subsequently worked for, even these workers conceded that health and safety was primarily a profitability issue for the company. Employees who couldn't work or who were absent caused problems for shift supervisors who had to fill the roster. And if they failed, production volumes might be affected. And of course, when major accidents happened, the line had to be stopped to tend to the injured and to allow for an investigation to take place regarding the cause and culpability. So it was very much in the company's best interest for its workers to remain healthy and at their stations. It's probably not a coincidence that as the company's tenure and future in Australia became tenuous, when profit margins tightened due to economic downturns, that the company doubled down on promoting safety. Interestingly, workers accepted the company's line that workplace safety was the company's top priority and that the company was doing everything in its power to make the workplace safe. So, when accidents and injuries did occur, it was generally workers who held themselves or each other responsible. And they certainly sometimes were responsible, such as when they engaged in a bit of horseplay and threw bolts and spanners at each other and extracted the odd injury. Most of the major accidents or serious injuries, such as machine operators having their fingers crushed or walking into the park of a forklift, generally occurred because of inattention, and thus, our interviewees suggested, was the fault of the inattentive or absent-minded worker placing their body in harm's way. They hadn't done as they were told. But we might ask, what causes this inattention or absent-mindedness? To what extent should an injured worker be held truly responsible when they're being required by the company to, say, work an 8-hour shift starting at 11 p.m. in the evening, or on mundane and repetitive tasks in a noisy environment where it's impossible to talk to a fellow worker and hence keep one's mind engaged and focused? In its final decade of operations, the company certainly had a better understanding of repetitive strain and posture injuries and its role in facilitating the prevention of these, so that employees were asked to cycle through various work tasks and stations so as not to be performing the same repetitive action for too long. Thus far, we've been unable to determine when this approach was introduced. We might even ponder whether it was ever fully embraced, because some workers still found themselves in awkward postures performing repetitive tasks for long periods of time in the 2000s, even if they were periodically shifted to different tasks. According to interviewees such as Brian Noonan, as late as the late 1970s, Holden was still resisting the demand by unions for workers to cycle through different tasks, and, to Noon's display, returned injured workers back to roles and workstations where they acquired their repetitive strain and posture injuries in the first place. In this case, I don't think we could hold workers responsible for their injuries or dismiss them as inevitable and unavoidable consequences of the industrial workplace. So much more can be said about Holden's health and safety culture, but I want to leave some time for questions and for some discussion, so I'll briefly conclude what I've been talking about. The testimony of Holden's former workers, I think, provides valuable insight into the formation, maintenance and consequences of the company's safety culture. At first glance, their narratives are surprising and somewhat contradictory. On one level, they reinforce the notion that the factory work was risky and dangerous, yet the vast majority of our interviewees indicated that they felt safe at work and that Holden was the best workplace they ever worked at in terms of health and safety. With some notable exceptions, most viewed their own injuries as minor and commonplace when compared to the incidence and severity of accidents that happen in other employment sectors. I think we could say they were anything but. One fellow, I mean, I didn't mention it in the presentation, but one fellow talked about getting metal shards in his eyes, which would fly off. Metal was sort of flying around. They meant to wear safety goggles. They didn't always wear safety goggles. And just was talking about this as a routine thing. They'll take themselves off to the medical centre and have these metal shards extracted. And as I said, I don't have to do that where I work. It's not a common workplace injury at the university. So our interviewees recalled accidents and injuries, torn flesh and bone, but often failed to, as I mentioned, mention the unseen injuries of labour, such as hearing loss and repetitive strain and posture-related injuries, which were actually more pervasive and sometimes equally as debilitating. Nearly all of our interviewees perceived Holden's safety record positively and with pride, noting the company's efforts to adopt and enforce safe practice and procedures, which partly accounts for why they tended to blame themselves or their workmates for accidents and injuries, which might otherwise be explained by the conditions of work, unreasonable demands by the company, or the factory environment itself. Company archives tend to obscure these individual and complex experiences of workplace safety in documents which focus on metrics such as time lost to accidents and injuries. While Holden's work as narratives are subjective, a careful analysis of their accounts, considering both what is said and unsaid, reveals nuanced details about workplace culture that are not contained in these official statistics. Thanks very much. Now, I'm very happy to take questions either about the project overall, and you might be interested in what else we've been trying to find out and the other things that we were looking at in the interviews, or happy to talk more about some of the points I made. Or you might have some of your own reflections of working at Holden or having family members work at Holden, and you might have a story about health and safety. Yes, in the front.